Last time we spoke about the Manchu restoration of Zhang Xun. After the death of Yuan Shikai, Duan Qirui maneuvered to maintain control amidst the political chaos. After being outed from premiership for trying to drag China into World War I, Duan Qirui was cast to the side as General Zhang Xun suddenly marched upon Beijing, seizing the capital. Zhang Xun then proclaimed the Qing Dynasty restored with Emperor Puyi back on the throne, shocking the entire nation. The Yuan Hung freaked out, ran for his life, and begged Duan Qirui to come back to save the republic. Ironically, Duan Qirui was already in the process of marching upon the capital, so with a smile he went along with everything, making it look like he was a hero. After taking back power, Duan Qirui resumed his premiership, but made sure to get rid of any threat to his authority. However, Duan Qirui's authoritarian rule and neglect of certain officers led to opposition from figures like Feng Zhang, who formed the Zhili clique. This episode is the invasion of Outer Mongolia and the First Anhui-Zhili War. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Over there, I just released a 2-hour-long documentary on the Opium Wars. It's probably worth your time to watch if you want a good laugh, because I had filmed the narration about 3 years ago, and I could barely pronounce a single province of China. It's pretty embarrassing. I was also filming with a literal teleprompter being a small TV in front of me, so I did everything in one take. Probably the dumbest thing you can do. Also, please check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel, where you can find exclusive podcasts. During the Xinai Revolution, many provinces and regions declared independence. One of them was Outer Mongolia. In 1910, the Qing Dynasty had appointed the Mongol Sando to be viceroy over Mongolia, with his base being at the capital city of Urga. Just a month after his arrival, conflicts emerged, prompting Sando to ask Jebstun Namba Kutuktu, the spiritual leader of the Mongolians, to help out, but he refused, and this led to a campaign to have Sando removed. More conflicts followed, and by spring of 1911, prominent Mongol nobles, such as Prince Togs Ocherin, Namnan Surin, who persuaded Jebstun Namba Kutotku to form a meeting of the nobility to discuss declaring independence. The meeting resulted in a deadlock. 18 nobles wishing to declare independence took matters into their own hands, pressuring Jebstun Namba Kutotku to send a secret delegation to Russia for help. Of course, at this time, Russia sought Outer Mongolia as a buffer state. The Mongols knew this, and they offered economic concessions if the Russians helped arm them and brought troops over. Now, Russia did not want to add Outer Mongolia to the empire, however. She offered diplomatic support rather than military support. The Russian minister to Beijing informed the Qing the Mongols had sent a delegation, and this prompted the Qing to order Sando to investigate. Yet while all of this was going on, the Wuchang uprising had sprung up, and soon rebellions would hit the entire nation. When the Mongols received news of what was happening in China, they simply joined in and declared independence. By December the 1st, a provisional government of Khalkha was set up under the theocratic rule of Jebstun Namba Kututku, who became the Bogd over the new Bogd Khanate. Fast forward to 1915, the new Republic of China and the Bogd Khanate reached an agreement that Outer Mongolia could be autonomous under Chinese suzerainty, a protectorate basically. Then came the Russian Revolution, and with it, the Russian Civil War. This resulted in a rather bizarre movement springing up along the Siberian-Mongolian border. Grigory Semyonov, a white Russian movement member in the Transbaikal region with Japanese backing, took quite an interest in Mongolia. Semyonov spoke Mongolian and Buryat fluently. He was also a soldier who fought in World War I and then during the Civil War. He led an anti-Soviet rebellion, but lost after a few months and was forced to flee to Harbin. He moved to Manchuria in Inner Mongolia, and from there he set up a base to launch raids into Siberia to help the White Movement. By the summer of 1918, he had managed to capture Chita, setting it up as his own capital, as he declared a great Mongol state. Semyonov fancied unifying the Oirat Mongol lands, parts of Xinjiang, Transbaikal, Inner and Outer Mongolia, Tenu-Urenkai, Kobdo, Hulenbia, and even Tibet to form a new Mongolian state. The situation caused a divide amongst the leadership in Outer Mongolia. Some favored their current protectorate relationship with China and wanted to end the Semyonov threat. Others were dissatisfied with the status quo, and they saw it as a great opportunity. The Chinese High Commissioner in Mongolia, Chen Yi, was soon delivered word from some of the Mongol nobles. Soviet forces were preparing to invade Mongolia. The Cossack consular guards at Urga, Kovd, and Ulistai had all fled. The Russian communities in Mongolia were beginning to support a Bolshevik regime. It was under said pretext Semyonov and his white Russian colleagues came into Mongolia. Chen Yi began frantically sending telegrams to Beijing requesting troops, while simultaneously persuading the Bogd Khan government to agree to allow a Chinese battalion to come on over. Chen Yi and the Mongol nobles came up with a document with 64 points titled, On Respecting of Outer Mongolia by the Government of China and Improvement of her Position in the Future after Self-Abolishing of Autonomy. Yes, they could have summarized the title of that document somewhat, though I imagine the English translation is lacking. The stipulations offered to replace the Mongolian government with Chinese officials, introduce Chinese garrisons, and the keeping of feudal titles. However, by July of 1918, the Soviet threat seemed to have dissipated. Meanwhile, Semyonov had assembled a detachment of Buryats and Inner Mongolian nationalists to fight for his pan-Mongolian cause. They made several attempts to try and persuade the Bogd Khan's government to join, but the Mongol nobles thought it foolish to throw their lot in with a new master they knew nothing about. Gradually, Semyonov threatened to invade Mongolia to force their compliance. The Bogd Khanate was in a bad position. They lacked the strength to repel Semyonov, but on the other hand, they were not interested in Chinese troops entering their lands either. Taking a step back, there was another player in the region. When the Manchu restoration of Zhang Xun broke out, Zhang Zuolin, the warlord of Manchuria, sat on the fence in Mukden. Yet a subordinate of his, Feng Tailing, had just unsuccessfully plotted against him and was implicated in the Manchu restoration. This gave Zhang Zuolin a good excuse to imprison and dismiss the man from his command, and better yet, he stole the man's troops. In August of 1917, Zhang Zuolin took over control of Heilongjiang province after a small rebellion had broken out there. Then in October, the warlord of Jilin province turned out to also be a Manchu restorationist, or at least Zhang Zuolin accused him of such, so he used diplomacy to get rid of the man. After this, Zhang Zuolin seized Jilin province and thus controlled all of Manchuria, excluding parts under Japanese occupation, of course. In February of 1918, Duan Qirui sent a rather unpopular subordinate named Xu Shucheng to try and persuade Zhang Zuolin to join the Anfu Club. The reason was because Duan Qirui distrusted Wu Beifu and the emerging Zhili clique, and he saw Zhang Zuolin as a beneficial ally. Xu Shucheng was the founder of the Anfu Club, the political arm of the Anhui clique. They recently earned 3/4 of the seats in the National Assembly. Xu Shucheng was also a fixer in many ways. At one point he discovered Liu Jianzhang had tried to persuade his nephew, Fang Yuxiang, the Christian warlord, to fight the Anhui clique. Xu Shucheng leaked this, and he had Liu executed. Thus he had a pretty rough reputation. Xu Shucheng came to Zhang Zuolin with a bribe from Duan Qirui. It was information that a shipment of Japanese arms worth 30,000 yuan, enough to equip roughly 7 mixed brigades, had just come to the port, over at Qinghuangdo. Zhang Zuolin performed a random inspection of said port and confiscated the goods. Reminds you of a New York mob situation. In response to this friendly gesture, Zhang Zuolin sent 50,000 of his troops southwards to aid Duan Qirui's new campaign that he had called the Unification by China by Force campaign. For this nice gesture, the Beiyang government gave Zhang Zuolin the title of Inspector of the three Manchurian provinces, basically just legitimizing what he was already controlling. At this point, Zhang Zuolin truly became known as the Tiger of Manchuria, or the King of the Northeast. Things were not great, but not bad between Duan and Zhang. Then Xu Shizheng received a new command, and things dramatically changed. Because of the situation in Outer Mongolia, Duan Qirui decided to form a new Northwestern Frontier Army, and he gave command of it to his right-hand man, Xu Shizheng. Now allegedly, this was also coerced by the Japanese, who had their own designs on Outer Mongolia. But Duan Qirui certainly had his own motives for such an action. The leaked information about the Nishihara loans, alongside other bad press, had most of the Chinese public against him. His reputation as a Republican patriot had been tarnished, even after defeating Zhang Xun. They had not done too much to reverse it. Duan Qirui had cultivated a large and strong army during World War I, but now the war was over, and all of his political enemies questioned why he was keeping the army around. Of course, everyone knew the real reason as to why. He wanted to defeat his rivals in the south to reunify China. When the Russians began encroaching into Mongolia, it was the perfect excuse to use said army, thus legitimizing it somewhat. Publicly, Duan Qirui stated the Northwestern Frontier Army would go to Outer Mongolia to defend them against Bolshevik encroachment. Their expedition was supposed to commence in July of 1919, but their train had broken down. In October, Xu Shizheng was forced to lead a spearhead of just 4,000 men to storm the capital of Urga. There was no actual battle. The Chinese entered peacefully, and they began occupying the capital. They were soon followed up by 10,000 additional troops who began to occupy most of Mongolia. Xu Shizheng met with Chen Yi and the Mongol nobles, and he stated the 64-point document needed to be renegotiated. He then submitted to them a much tougher set of conditions, calling for the express declaration of Chinese sovereignty over Mongolia, to increase Mongolia's population via Chinese colonization, and to promote commerce, industry, and agriculture. If the Mongols resisted these conditions, Xu Shizheng threatened to deport the Balkan to China. To make a point, Xu then placed troops directly in front of the Balkan's palace. It seems Xu may have also been pressured by Japan to install some pro-Japanese Chinese officials in Mongolia to thwart any future Russian encroachment. These demands, titled the 8 Articles, were given to the Mongolian parliament on November the 15th, and the upper house accepted them, but the lower house did not. Many members publicly called for armed resistance. The most tenacious were the Buddhist monks who tried to fight off the Chinese, but the upper house ultimately prevailed. Then a petition to end the autonomy signed by the ministers and deputy ministers of the Balkan's government were presented to Xu. Balkan refused to give his seal still after all this. Then the new prime minister was installed by orders of Xu Shizheng. His name, and do forgive me, was Gonchig Jalzagan Badamdor. Alongside the conservatives within the Mongolian political scene, they forced the acceptance of the Chinese demands. Xu Shizheng was hailed as a hero in China. Dr. Sun Yat-sen even sent a letter of congratulations from the rival Guangzhou government. It was clearly satirical, but those like Duan Qirui paraded it around as propaganda. Now Xu Shizheng then humiliated the Mongolian Council of Khans in a speech and would return in February of 1920 to preside over an extremely humiliating ceremony. During the ceremony, the Balkan and other Mongol nobles were forced to kowtow before Xu Shizheng and the new 5 races banner. This ceremony was so insulting, it would mark the beginning of active Mongolian resistance against China. The occupation of Mongolia had aroused frustration from Zhang Zuolin because he regarded Mongolia to be within his sphere of influence. Xu Shizheng, after occupying Mongolia, began to set up banks in the northwest, raised public loans, and all of this, of course, was done to increase his own personal power. At this time, since he was the second strongest Anhui clique leader, he had so many forces under his thumb, he was seen to be even greater than Zhang Zuolin, the inspector of the 3 provinces of Manchuria. Xu Shicheng's northwestern army had troops in Inner Mongolia, Gansu, Xinjiang, and Shaanxi. Now, while Zhang Zuolin's Fengtian clique could not hope to defeat the Anhui clique alone, they were not in fact alone. Zhang Zuolin, with his ear to the political ongoings in northern China, would find a new ally to thwart Duan and Shu. We're going to need to rewind just a little bit here to explain the rather chaotic political situation in northern China. After Zhang Xun's Manchu restoration was defeated, Duan Qirui found himself in a bit of an awkward position. He was now the defender of the Republic. He took back his premiership, but his puppet, Li Yuanheng, had fled his position as president. It was now Feng Guozhang who was president. Now, Feng Guozhang was not elected or anything. He was merely filling out the remaining term of Li Yuanheng. Before leaving Nanjing to come over to Beijing, Feng Guozhang compelled Duan to accept his appointees to offices in the Yangtze area, where his power base was located. There was a division of military power now, a sort of split within the Beiyang army between the premier and the president. This led to the creation of the Anfu Club, that of Duan followers, and in turn the Zhili clique of Feng followers. The Anfu Club was far better organized, better funded, and was dominated by Duan and Shu. Shu, by the way, was nicknamed Little Shu because he was seen as simply a Duan Qirui lackey, as they say. The Anfu Club also had high-ranking politicians within it, like Wang Yitang, Zhang Yujian, and Liu Engue. Yet the Anfu Club was not really an alliance of military guys. It was more a political force that exerted influence over parliament and other parts of the civil bureaucracy. There was no war at this point, despite the obvious conflict between Duan and Feng. Thus, the fighting was all within the political realm for the while. They simply fought for control over government institutions and such. Duan and Feng's main objective at this time was to simply dominate parliament, and Duan was certainly winning. Duan made Wang Yitang the Speaker of the House, who made sure Feng could not dissolve parliament. If Feng dissolved parliament, it would call for an election that could see Duan lose premiership again. Now, a little bit about the Zhili clique. From 1917 to 1920, the clique was not really united politically or militarily. They were really a riffraff of pissed-off Beiyang officers and politicians whom Duan Qirui had overlooked. Their most influential military commanders in the beginning were Wang Jianyuan, the warlord of Hubei, Li Chun and Chen Guangyan, the warlords of Jiangsu. The Zhili clique lacked strong leadership and a real source of funding. They did not have much influence over parliament. Thus, they were quite hopeless against the Anhui clique, who were also getting stronger each day. In October of 1918, the Anfu Club managed to secure a new president, Xu Shicheng, who was the former viceroy of Manchuria, considered a safe pick by the Anfu members. Xu lacked a following. He was quite old, an academic type, someone they all assumed could be easily manipulated, basically like a new Li Yuanheng. By the end of 1918, the Anfu Club appeared to be in a position to actually unify China for the first time since the death of Yuan Shikai. However, they depended heavily on Japanese loans, and as a result, easily fell victim to those who would label them to be in league with Japan. Members of the Zhili clique capitalized on this, spreading accusations left, right, and center, making public statements accusing the Anfu members of selling China out to Japan. By 1919, the Anfu Club still looked sturdy, but then the Treaty of Versailles suddenly hit. The public outrage to the peace talks led many Anhui clique members of Duan's cabinet to actually flee to Japan. Then the May 4th movement began, prompting the Zhili clique to latch themselves on to the cause of the student protesters. Duan Qirui realized his stronghold over Beijing was becoming fragile. Any direct attack against another warlord would be very dangerous, thus he tried to do things covertly. He began by trying to economically strangle areas of his enemies. He reduced government funds to their provinces, for example. He also tried to set up new appointments in central provinces to dominate them. He appointed General Zhang Jingyao to be the military governor of Hunan province. Wu Peifu, whose power base was in Sichuan and western Hunan, saw this as a direct threat. Now, when this was occurring, Japan was facing economic problems and thus could no longer loan much money to the Anhui clique. This led the Anfu Club to seek out a new source of revenue. Meanwhile, Wu Peifu reacted to the threat to his territory by seeking out support from the Zhili clique. In particular, he went to his old mentor, Cao Qin. Cao Qin had been an officer in the Beiyang army. Initially, he did not side with Feng or Duan. When the Anhui clique began to move into central China, this drove Cao Qin to the Zhili clique. Wu Peifu approached his old mentor with a plan. It was to be a campaign against the Anhui clique. Cao Qin agreed to the idea, but only if Wu Peifu could prove there would be enough forces capable of attacking Anhui's power base around Beijing. Wu Peifu then went to work calling upon the warlords of Sichuan province, Shanxi province, and Hubei, who were all not receiving much funding from the central government at the time. Thus, they all banded together. In November of 1919, Wu Peifu met with Tang Jiao and Lu Rongting at Hongyang, where they signed a treaty entitled The Rough Draft of the National Salvation Allied Army. This effectively formed the basis of a true anti-Anhui clique alliance. After this, in April of 1920, while visiting a memorial service at Baoding for soldiers who died in Hunan, Cao Qin added more warlords to the new anti-Anhui clique alliance. This would include warlords in Hubei, Hunan, Liaoning, Jilin, Liangjiang, Jiangsu, Jiangxi, and Zhili. The conflict became public as both sides began deploying for the coming war. By May of 1920, Wu Peifu was preparing to launch a campaign to strike into northern China, and he began to mobilize his armies up at the Tianjin-Pukou Railway. Yet before this, he also did something else. Wu Peifu extended a hand to a very unlikely figure, Zhang Zuolin. He explained his campaign plan to Zhang Zuolin, and he advised him a campaign from the northeast above the Great Wall might be very beneficial to them both, wink wink. Thus, in March of 1920, Zhang Zuolin had arranged a feast in Mukden for the warlords of Zhili, Jiangsu, Jiangxi, Hubei, Hunan, Liaoning, Jilin, and Heiliangjiang. It was a secret conference to set up a solid 8-province alliance against the Anhui clique. This rather intense period of scheming saw President Xu Shiqiang invite Zhang Zuolin over for a meeting in Beijing. American writer Nathaniel Peffer was there, and he had this to say of Zhang Zuolin. Until his triumphant entry into Peking in 1920, Zhang Zuolin had not come down out of his Mukden fastness for years. In those years, a legend had grown up around him, a legend of fierce, uncouth, primitive creature of the wilds. It was with some zest, therefore, that I accepted an invitation of his nearly English-speaking secretary to attend an audience for foreign correspondence. It was with even greater amazement that I found myself bowing to a slender, delicate little person in subdued silks, soft-spoken, and with hands as lovely and graceful as I had ever seen on a man. The terror of the North Country looked like a precious aesthete. There was nothing of the aesthete in his speech or his demeanor. However, the interview was marked by none of the usual subtle evasion, the nice circumlocution. There was a blunt talk on both sides, and it was eloquent that, when our questions verged on the brutally frank, the secretary who was interpreting did not translate them as they were put, but softened them until the meaning was transformed. The quailing of the servitors when the tea was a second late was also eloquent. When he recommended the execution of a whole regiment as a proper punishment for mutiny, one was glad the regiment was not in his command. During this meeting, Zhang Zuolin told President Xu he had no idea what a Zhili clique or Zhili group or what an Anfu group was. He simply said everyone should just cooperate in general for the northern cause. Then Zhang Zuolin traveled from Beijing to Baoding to meet with the Zhili's de facto leader, Cao Qin. As Zhang Zuolin was on his way, the anti-Anfu coalition managed to force President Xu Shiqiang to dismiss Xu Shijiang from all of his posts. Allegedly, after this, President Xu Shijiang sent an invitation to Zhang Zuolin to come back to his residence after his trip to Baoding, where he planned to kill him. Premier Duan Qirui heard of the plan to kill him, and he told the president not to go through with it, because Zhang Zuolin had thus far supported him. Nonetheless, Zhang Zuolin hightailed it back to Manchuria under a disguise. Once back in Mukden, Zhang Zuolin sent a telegram to President Xi and Duan stating, "In the future, instead of mediating politically, I will do so militarily." In July, various Zhili and Fengtian generals such as Tao Kun, Zhang Zuolin, Wang Jianyuan, Li Shun, Qian Guangyuan, Zhao Qi, and Mao Fuxian all signed a denunciation of the Anhui clique and its political arm, the Anfu Club. This denunciation was circulated through a telegram called the Pao Tingfu on July the 12th. This saw an outraged Duan Qirui demand President Xu Shucheng dismiss Tao Kun and Zhang Zuolin from all of their positions. In response to the very obvious threat, Duan Qirui formed the National Stabilization Army using 5 divisions and 4 combined brigades with himself as commander-in-chief and General Xu Shucheng as his general chief of staff. Duan deployed his forces in 2 fronts, the west covering the regions of Zhouzhou, Guan, and Laishui, and the east covering the hamlet of Beijimiao, Yang, and Liang. Zhao Kun gathered the 3rd Division and 9 combined brigades to form a traitor suppression army, with Wu Peifu as the frontline commander-in-chief. The Zhili clique deployed their forces in the region of the Yang Hamlet and due west of Gaobei. In the northeast, Zhang Zuolin deployed 3 divisions, roughly 70,000 men strong, at the Machang and Juliancheng area. The battle plan was for the Zhili clique to strike from the south, converging on Baoding and then Beijing, while the Fengtian clique would advance through the Shanhai Pass of the Great Wall to attack the northern territories. The Anhui clique basically held dominance over the Beijing area, Anhui, and along most of China's coast. However, the Zhili clique now was dominating Jiangsu province, thus severing the vital railway that the Anhui clique depended on to move their troops from north to south. While Duan Qirui could see the Zhili were mobilizing, the appearance of 3 Fengtian divisions advancing through Shanhaiguan caught him by complete surprise. Duan Qirui, in a rather panicked fashion, ordered his troops in the capital to converge around Tianjin, where he was forced to meet both enemies on a southern and northern front. On July the 14th of 1920, the Anhui army made their first move by simultaneously attacking both fronts. Zhili troops were forced to abandon Gaobei, and 2 days later, with Japanese assistance, the Anhui forces were able to capture the Yang Hamlet, forcing the Zhili forces to form a second defensive line in the Beitang region. It was at Beitang where the Anhui forces finally lost their momentum and were halted. On July the 17th, Wu Peifu personally took command of the Zhili Western Front, where he unleashed a very daring maneuver. He outflanked the Anhui forces at Zhouzhou, and he proceeded to storm the Western Anhui Army HQ. There, Wu Peifu captured the Anhui frontline commander-in-chief, Qi Tongfeng, and many of his officers, including the 1st Division commander. After the capture of Zhouzhou, Wu Peifu pursued the retreating Anhui forces towards Beijing. With the exception of the Anhui's 15th Division, their western front was all but annihilated. Also on the same day, the Fengtian army crashed into the Anhui eastern front. General Xu Shucheng received word of the collapse of the western front, and this prompted him to flee to Langfang and then to Beijing, leaving his forces to surrender to the combined forces of Wu Peifu and Zhang Zuolin. While the majority of the Anhui forces would be taken prisoner, many also managed to escape to Zhejiang and Shanghai. But they were just a fraction of the army they used to be. By July the 19th, Duan Qirui realized he had lost the war, and he publicly announced he was resigning from all of his posts. On the 23rd, the combined Zhili and Fengtian forces entered Nanyuan and then gradually pacified Beijing, accepting the surrender of the Anhui clique. In less than a week of battle, the strongest clique was unexpectedly defeated. Zhang Zuolin's military capabilities received an incredible boom for the short little battle. His men had captured vast quantities of arms, armaments, ammunition, and military vehicles from the Japanese-financed Frontier Defense Army of the Anhui clique. It allegedly took 100 railway wagons to send all the looted goods back to Mukden, alongside 12 captured aircraft. Zhang Zuolin also suffered pretty much nothing during the battle. The Fengtian army had merely put up a heavy force on the field. They actually sat back most of the time, did little fighting. It allowed Wu Peifu to take the lion's share of the actual action against the enemy. At this junction, Zhang Zuolin faced 2 large decisions. The The first one, he could return to his power base in the northeast with assurances Beijing would not interfere with the developments of said provinces. The Japanese were likewise constantly hassling Zhang Zuolin to refrain from getting too involved in the national political scene. They just wanted him to develop his own region. Obviously, Japan was arguing this while dangling financial aid because they were heavily invested in Manchuria and they did not want any threats aimed at it, especially from Beijing. Wang Yongjiang, who would become a brilliant economic administrator to the Fengtian clique, whom aided in a lot of economic reforms, believed the northeastern provinces could develop while keeping out of anything south of the Great Wall just well. He also added his voice, arguing Zhang Zuolin should stay the hell away from Beijing and its chaos. The second choice was, of course, diving right into said chaos. After the fall of the Anhui clique, Zhang Zuolin for the first time had tasted real victory, especially one over a superior adversary. For the first time, he had the opportunity to influence the politics of China. He could stop being just a mere bandit leader. Could someone like Zhang Zuolin be the man to reunify China? This he wondered. Would Zhang Zuolin go back to being just the tiger of Manchuria, or become the man who would lead all of China? What do you think he chose? I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. Hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Or at Spotify, I also have a podcast series. On the YouTube channel, I just released a 2-hour documentary on the Opium Wars. Over on my podcast series on Spotify and whatever podcast platforms you listen to podcasts from, I just released an episode on the Battle of Taranto, and a rather comical episode on me and my Canadian friends' take on the French-Indian War, after quite a few beers, mind you. It's an interesting one. Also, please check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel, where you can find exclusive podcasts. We're also about to set up a live Q&A gaming session, so if you ever want to ask me questions and stuff, jump in. It'll probably be premiered on the YouTube channel as well. The occupation of Mongolia looked like a good idea at the time for Duan Qirui. Perhaps it could save his reputation, so he could focus on defeating the pesky southern warlords. What a shock it was to find out that the North rallied together to knock him off his tower. Now the Zhili and Fengtian cliques controlled Beijing, but could they work together? Or would they simply fall into conflict, furthering China's misery?